Every legend has an origin, and the tale of the Tarrasque begins in the mists of real-world mythology. The very name Tarrasque is drawn from French folklore. Le Tarrasque, a fearsome dragon-like beast said to have terrorized the medieval countryside of Provence. According to the legend, the Tarrasque was a chimeric monstrosity, often described with the head of a lion, 6 stout bear-like legs, the shell of a turtle, and a scaly tail tipped with a deadly sting. This fearsome creature ravaged the region around the Rhone River, laying waste to crops and villages. It withstood every attempt by knights and soldiers to slay it, until a gentle saint named Martha approached. Through compassion and prayer, Saint Martha miraculously tamed the beast, rendering it peaceful. But the story ended tragically. When she led the tamed Tarrasque back to the town, the terrified townsfolk attacked and killed the creature. Overcome with remorse, the people renamed their town in its honor, Tarascon, a name that endures in France to this day, and placed the image of the vanquished Tarrasque on their coat of arms. The legend thus portrays the Tarrasque as a deadly but ultimately pitiable creature, felled by fear and misunderstanding. Dungeons & Dragons, ever eager to borrow from myth and legend, took inspiration from this French tale. But the game's portrayal of the Tarrasque would be even more terrifying and far less tameable. When Gary Gygax and the designers at TSR introduced the Tarrasque to the game, they transformed the folkloric beast into something truly apocalyptic. The D&D Tarrasque shares a few traits with its mythical namesake: an armored body like a great shell, multiple horns, and a lashing tail. But any echoes of the Tarrasque's tamability or semi-divine redemption are stripped away. In D&D lore, the Tarrasque is an unstoppable engine of annihilation, a creature with no soul to redeem and no pity to be found, only hunger and destruction. From the moment of its debut, the Tarrasque was positioned as the pinnacle of D&D's monster food chain. Early promotional blurbs and designer commentary hinted that this creature was loosely based on the Tarrasque legend, a turtle-shelled French dragon charmed by a saintly woman, as one article later noted, but with the volume turned up to mythic proportions. In a sense, the Tarrasque can be seen as D&D's answer to the kaiju of Japanese film like Godzilla, a colossal, city-crushing beast that embodies raw, elemental force. Indeed, the Tarrasque's profile, a towering reptilian titan with a penchant for flattening civilizations, has more in common with the modern pop culture idea of a giant monster than the relatively obscure medieval Tarrasque legend. It represents the concept of nature's fury or divine wrath incarnate, roaming the material plane. As we explore the Tarrasque's journey through each edition of D&D, it's important to remember this dual heritage. On one hand, it has roots in a specific piece of mythology. On the other, it quickly evolved into a unique creation of D&D, with its own lore and role to play. Over the decades, the Tarrasque's story and characteristics have been expanded and reinterpreted. Each edition of the game, from the early days of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons through to 5th edition and beyond, has contributed new layers to the creature's mythos, whether through subtle changes in description or through outright new origin stories and narrative context. Before diving into the edition-by-edition evolution, one more thing sets the stage: the singular nature of the Tarrasque. In most D&D lore, it is emphasized that there is only one Tarrasque in existence, at least per world. This instantly sets it apart from other monsters. Encountering a dragon or beholder is one thing, but encountering the Tarrasque is something else entirely. It's akin to a unique world boss or final nemesis. This idea may have been inspired by the Tarrasque myth, which featured a lone creature. But in D&D it takes on a bigger meaning, suggesting that Tarrasque is not a species, but an event, a solitary cataclysm that wanders the world. Many campaign settings adopt this approach, speaking of the Tarrasque as a one-of-a-kind terror slumbering beneath the earth. As we will see, a few exceptions and contradictions to the only one rule pop up in obscure lore, but the image of a lone legendary destroyer remains dominant in the D&D imagination. With the stage set by real-world myth and a clear intent to create the ultimate monster within the game, the Tarrasque lumbered onto the scene of D&D in the early 1980s. From that point on, it captured the imaginations of players and dungeon masters, securing its place in the pantheon of iconic D&D creatures. Let us now step through time and examine how each era of Dungeons & Dragons has portrayed this terrifying titan, starting with its very first appearance. The Tarrasque made its grand debut in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition, instantly establishing itself as a creature of legend. It appeared in the Monstrous Manual 2, published in 1983, a compilation of new monsters that expanded the original Monster Manual's roster. In a book filled with demons, dragons, and other horrors, the Tarrasque stood out as arguably the most fearsome entry. Dungeon masters reading its description could immediately recognize that this monster was meant to challenge even the most powerful of adventurers, perhaps serving as the final obstacle of an epic campaign. In its 1st edition portrayal, the Tarrasque is described as a gigantic reptilian monstrosity, roughly 50 feet long and 25 feet tall, about 15 meters by 8 meters, weighing many hundreds of tons. It walks on all fours with an almost bear-like gait, but can rear up in a terrifying bipedal stance when attacking. Its skin is covered in a thick, reflective carapace, often likened to a fused, blistered shell, or scales as hard as adamantine. 2 large horns protrude from its head, and its maw bristles with dagger-like teeth the size of swords. A long, powerful tail snakes behind it, capable of sweeping foes off their feet or toppling towers with a single blow. In sum, it looks like some primeval cross between a dinosaur and a demon, an embodiment of destruction given flesh. What truly cemented the Tarrasque's reputation were its near-invincible qualities, as listed in the AD&D rules. The Monster Manual 2 entry reads like a laundry list of nightmare fuel for players. The Tarrasque has immense strength, speed that belies its size, able to rush 60 feet in a round, outpacing many fleeing victims, and a battery of attacks, a biting maw, crushing horns, raking claws, and a lashing tail. In fact, it was noted as having a total of 6 attacks each round, more than enough to tear a whole adventuring party apart in seconds. Its bite was explicitly compared to a magical sword of sharpness, a nod to a special effect. On a sufficiently high attack roll, 18 or higher on the die, the Tarrasque's bite would sever limbs or even behead its target outright. This gruesome detail captured the imagination. One snap of its jaws could lop off an arm, a leg, or worse, no matter how heroic the foe. Defensively, the creature was even more frightening. The Tarrasque's armored hide was said to be so tough that ordinary weapons could not harm it at all. Only weapons of magic quality could even pierce its flesh. Even many forms of magic would falter against it. The Tarrasque's carapace was described as reflecting or deflecting certain spells, notably rays and beams like lightning bolts or magic missiles. This gave rise to the legend that spells simply slide off its back or bounce back at the caster, making direct magical assaults perilous. Furthermore, the Tarrasque possessed a degree of regeneration, slowly but steadily healing any damage it did sustain. In 1st edition, it regenerated 1 hit point every round, making it effectively immortal unless overwhelmed by tremendous force. Perhaps the most notorious aspect of the first edition Tarrasque was the clause about its death, or near lack thereof. The lore stated that if the Tarrasque was somehow brought to the brink of death, mere damage was not enough to finish it off. The only way to truly slay the Tarrasque was said to be through powerful magic, specifically the use of a wish spell. In game terms, even if heroic characters reduced the beast to 0 hit points, the Tarrasque would eventually regenerate and rise again unless a wish spell, the mightiest of mortal magics, was used to ensure its demise. This effectively meant the creature was almost unkillable in the absence of near-divine intervention. The notion of needing a wish to kill it transcended mere mechanics and became part of the creature's legend. Bards might sing that no mortal blade can kill the beast. Only a wish upon the gods can seal it away forever. The first edition entry also hinted at the Tarrasque's effect on the world around it. It was said that the creature ravages the countryside for miles around, leaving behind a barren wasteland. In its wake, nothing remains but trampled ground and devastation. Forests are flattened, villages reduced to rubble, and all living things devoured or driven off. The land itself takes years to recover from a Tarrasque's passage. This imagery of the Tarrasque's hunger laying waste to entire regions helped solidify it, not just as a strong monster, but as a cataclysmic event. Encountering the Tarrasque wasn't like stumbling on a dragon's lair. It was more akin to surviving an earthquake, followed by a famine. It made the Tarrasque's appearances in a campaign world into historical events remembered for generations. Another characteristic introduced in first edition was the Tarrasque's aura of terror. The mere sight of the monster was said to strike overwhelming fear into those who beheld it. Game-wise, low-level characters, below a certain level threshold, would be frozen in place, paralyzed by fear with no saving throw, simply by witnessing the towering horror. Somewhat stronger-willed individuals might not be paralyzed but would still flee in panic, unless they were seasoned heroes of significant level. This detail underscores the narrative idea that only the bravest or most foolhardy would stand their ground against the Tarrasque. Lesser beings simply could not bear its presence. In a cinematic sense, one can imagine soldiers dropping their weapons and running at the first glimpse of the beast cresting the horizon, or peasants in a city overcome by dread as the walls tremble under its approach. Though the first edition Monster Manual to description was relatively concise, it left a lot of implied storytelling on the table. Notably, it did not elaborate on where the Tarrasque came from or why it existed. It simply presented the creature as a unique menace. In those early days, many dungeon masters would fill in the blanks with their own imagination. Was the Tarrasque a punishment sent by the gods for mortal sins? Was it a last survivor of some prehistoric age, awakened from a deep sleep? Or perhaps an alien being from another plane or world? The official text remained silent on these questions, which only added to the mystery and mystique. One thing, however, was clear from the start in that first edition entry. Fortunately, only one Tarrasque exists. This line, stated or implied, was a small mercy offered to the campaign world and a storytelling cue. It meant that if a Tarrasque appeared, it was the Tarrasque. The definitive article was always used. And if it was somehow defeated, there would be no next one, at least not without some extraordinary twist. This uniqueness made it somewhat akin to a force of nature or a singular mythic beast, like the kraken of ancient seafaring lore, or the lone Fenris wolf of Norse myth destined to emerge at the world's end. With all these qualities, the Tarrasque quickly gained a reputation at gaming tables. many dungeon masters saw it as the nuclear option, a monster to deploy only in the most extreme scenarios, perhaps if the campaign story truly called for an apocalyptic threat, or, as became half-jokingly common, if the players had completely derailed the game and the DM whimsically decided to declare, "Rocks fall, everyone dies, and by the way, the Tarrasque shows up." It became an inside joke in the community that when all else fails, unleash the Tarrasque. Such humor belied the genuine awe the creature inspired. Players who encountered a Tarrasque legitimately as part of a story knew they were in the fight of their lives. It is worth noting that during the era of First Edition, the D&D multiverse was still coalescing in terms of lore. The Tarrasque wasn't yet strongly attached to any particular world like Greyhawk or the Forgotten Realms. It was simply a monster that any DM could insert into their world if they wished. As such, early modules and adventures didn't immediately feature the Tarrasque. After all, few published adventures at the time were geared for the ultra-high-level play required to confront it. The Tarrasque was more of a toolkit monster, a legendary beast waiting in the wings for the rare group of characters mighty or foolish enough to challenge it. Nevertheless, one early adventure did dare to utilize the Tarrasque, giving players a shot at facing this juggernaut. In 1986, TSR released an AD and D module titled H2, The Mines of Bloodstone. This was part of the high-level Bloodstone Pass series, which was explicitly designed for very powerful characters, levels 15 and up, even into the hundreds using AD and D's optional rules. In the Mines of Bloodstone adventure, the heroes undergo a series of deadly challenges, and one of these is aptly named the Test of Might. In that test, the party is pitted against none other than the Tarrasque itself. This encounter was a kind of ultimate gladiatorial trial, a no-holds-barred fight to survive against the most dangerous creature known. Many players of the era have recounted the shock and thrill of realizing that their characters were about to battle the legendary Tarrasque, even though it was a staged encounter in a controlled environment, and not the Tarrasque rampaging freely across the countryside. It demonstrated that the creature indeed had a place in the game's most epic stories. Surviving such a fight, let alone winning it, was an achievement that would crown a D&D campaign's climax. Thus, by the end of the first edition's tenure, the Tarrasque had already cemented itself as a legend within the game. It arrived fully formed as the archetypal World Eater, nearly indestructible, terrifying beyond measure, and blessedly unique. Players swapped tales of how to or how not to take one down, and DMs schemed about how and when to incorporate it into their worlds. But the story of the Tarrasque was only just beginning. With the transition to AD&D 2nd Edition in 1989, the creature's lore would expand, offering new insights and new questions about its purpose and origins. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition 1989 to 2000 inherited the Tarrasque from its predecessor and continued to elevate its legendary status. In many ways, the 2nd Edition version of the Tarrasque was very similar to the 1st Edition incarnation. Unsurprising, since many monsters' stats and descriptions carried over with only minor edits. However, 2nd Edition's rulebooks often placed a greater emphasis on lore ecology and origin theories for monsters, offering tantalizing bits of in-world context that earlier editions sometimes omitted. The Tarrasque benefited from this approach, while remaining the same terrifying engine of destruction mechanically. It gained a more mythic backstory, or rather multiple possible backstories, that deepened its place in D&D mythology. The primary 2nd Edition source for the Tarrasque was the Monstrous Compendium series. and later, the compiled Monstrous Manual. In terms of raw stats and abilities, the Tarrasque in second edition was much the same creature, a gargantuan, nearly unkillable behemoth. A few mechanical tweaks were made. For instance, it was explicitly immune to fire now, clarifying that even dragon fire or magical flames could not harm it. It also continued to reflect spells from its carapace, regenerate wounds, and induce terror. One quirk in the Monstrous Manual entry caused a bit of confusion. It listed the Tarrasque's THAC, to hit score, as an impossibly good value, accompanied by an odd note that creatures with a negative THAC 0 can only be hit on a 1. This was later clarified as a typo or a misstatement. What the writer intended was likely that the Tarrasque itself almost never misses its attacks, only failing on a natural roll of 1. Such was the creature's prowess that the game's own mechanics strained to describe it. But beyond numbers, what stood out in second edition were the sections often titled Ecology or Habitat Society, which for the Tarrasque ventured into the realm of speculation and legend, since hardly any mortal scholar in a game world would have observed the Tarrasque in its natural habitat, if it even has one. The compilers of lore within the game naturally present theories and myths. These pieces of flavor text read like the conjectures of sages and the fireside tales of bards, adding depth to the creature's mystique. One prominent thread introduced was the idea that the Tarrasque might have been created by powerful beings for a specific purpose. The Monstrous Manual mentions, for example, that elemental princes of evil could have fashioned the Tarrasque in aeons past. This suggests that the Tarrasque is not a product of evolution or ordinary nature, but a weapon, a living weapon of mass destruction unleashed by primordial forces. The elemental princes of evil, imagine the likes of Imix, Prince of Evil Fire, or the other archomentals of earth, air, and water in their dark aspects, perhaps collaborated to create a creature that combined their destructive powers. In some legends, these elemental evils forged the Tarrasque to punish the world, or to spite the gods of goodness and order. The text doesn't confirm this definitively. It presents it as one possible origin story whispered among scholars. But the imagery is vivid. One can imagine a council of hateful elemental lords pooling their wrath to birth a titan of ruin, a being that consumes all life, whether rooted in earth, air, fire, or water. Another hypothesis offered in second edition's lore is that the Tarrasque might be a great reptilian punisher sent by the gods to end the world. This is almost the flip side of the previous idea. Rather than an act of evil, the Tarrasque could be an instrument of divine judgment. In this interpretation, some deity or pantheon long ago created the Tarrasque as a doomsday mechanism, a kind of ultimate reset button for civilization. If mortals grew too arrogant or the balance of the world tipped too far into corruption, the gods could unleash the Tarrasque to scour the land clean, after which life could begin anew. This theory casts the Tarrasque in the role of an avenger or purifier, albeit a mindless one. It also resonates with real-world flood myths or apocalypse stories, where a higher power sends a cataclysm to humble or destroy a wayward civilization. Both of these origin tales, one attributing the Tarrasque to elemental evil, the other to divine retribution, paint it as something more than just a random monster. They frame it as a creature with a cosmic purpose, even if the purpose is simply destruction. Interestingly, the two ideas aren't mutually exclusive. Different cultures in a campaign world might have different beliefs about the Tarrasque's origin. For instance, A druidic sect might fervently believe the Tarrasque is nature's ultimate answer to civilization's hubris, leaning toward the God's punishment angle, whereas an order of elemental cultists might point to ancient tablets that claim the Tarrasque was born from the union of fire, earth, air, and water in their most malignant forms. During the second edition's era, we also see more integration of the Tarrasque into published campaign lore. The Forgotten Realms setting, which rose to prominence in second edition, started to include references to the Tarrasque in its voluminous sourcebooks and novels. Ed Greenwood and other writers treated the creature as a known, if exceedingly rare, part of the world's bestiary, and they wove it into a few historical anecdotes. For example, a story emerged of an ancient Tabaxi human tribe, not to be confused with the feline race of the same name, in a distant land who worshipped a colossal beast known as the Sleeper. This Sleeper was in fact a Tarrasque that dwelt in the continent of Katashaka, a rarely seen land far from the main action of the realms. According to legend, the Sleeper would awaken infrequently, perhaps once in centuries, and demand sacrifices. The tribe would appease it with offerings and blood, treating it as a living god-tyrant. One cycle, as the story goes, the Sleeper awakened enraged and went on a rampage that threatened to annihilate the tribe. Desperate, the tribal leaders prayed to their patron, the god Ubtao, who imbued a chosen warrior with the power to confront the beast. In a titanic battle, this champion miraculously managed to slay the Tarrasque, an unthinkable feat, by using divine magic to halt and crush it. The tale ends with the Sleeper dead and the tribe saved, though one must imagine the landscape was forever scarred by the conflict. This story, part myth and part history and realms lore, underscores a crucial point. Even the Tarrasque, for all its invincibility, is not truly immortal if enough divine favor or cosmic power is brought to bear. It also demonstrates how different cultures within the game world interpret the monster. For some, it is a godlike being to be placated or worshipped, out of fear, if not reverence. Another famous realms tale from the Netheril era tells of how archwizard Karsus, he of the legendary Folly, where he tried to steal the power of the goddess of magic, once sought the Tarrasque for a component in a spell. In the final years before Netheril's catastrophic fall, circa -339 Dale Reckoning, thousands of years ago, a group of adventurers under Karsus's employ journeyed to a remote region where a Tarrasque lay dormant. The creature's lair, known in local folk tales as the Lair of the Sleeping Beast, was carefully watched by tribes of barbarians who lived in fear of its awakening. Karsus's agents, with the help of a powerful gold dragon ally, managed to approach the sleeping Tarrasque and surgically extract its pituitary gland of all things, needed for a mighty spell. To keep the beast from awakening during this grisly procedure, the dragon had provided a potion or draught to keep it in magical slumber. Incredibly, the mission succeeded. The gland was taken, destined to be used in Karsus's ultimately disastrous spell, and the Tarrasque did not immediately rise to take revenge. However, the very fact that Netherese wizards dared to tamper with the beast speaks volumes about the hubris of that age, and perhaps offers a cautionary footnote that even defeating a Tarrasque through trickery can have world-shaking consequences down the line. The Greyhawk setting, D&D's original campaign world, had fewer published references to the Tarrasque, since Greyhawk's major sourcebooks predated the creature's introduction or didn't focus on it. But it was generally assumed that Oerth, the world of Greyhawk, had its own slumbering Tarrasque somewhere, waiting in case a DM wanted to include an end-of-days scenario. In later fan lore and some third-party Greyhawk materials, there are hints and stories, One legend places a Tarrasque in the vast dry seabed of the Sea of Dust, left over from a magically induced cataclysm, perhaps waiting beneath ash and sand to one day reawaken. Greyhawk's deities of destruction or wild nature, like the god Erythnol, could be tied into such myths, but nothing official in 2nd edition Greyhawk literature pinned it down explicitly. Back on the more mechanical side, 2nd edition clarified the Tarrasque's alignment and intellect. In the stat block, its alignment was essentially neutral, but more precisely noted as nil. This term caused some questions among players. Did nil mean it had no alignment at all? In fact, nil was a way some 2nd edition materials indicated that a creature wasn't intelligent enough to have moral or ethical alignment. Essentially, the Tarrasque doesn't make choices of good or evil. It just is. It acts on pure instinct. A sage advice column from the era confirms that nil was intended to be read as equivalent to neutral for an animalistic creature. Not neutral in a philosophical sense, but unaligned, driven by hunger rather than malice. This is an important nuance. It means the Tarrasque is not evil in the way a demon or even a chromatic dragon is. It doesn't destroy because it enjoys others' suffering or because it has some wicked agenda. It destroys because that is its nature, perhaps its only purpose. This makes it in some ways even more terrifying, like a hurricane or an earthquake given flesh and teeth. You cannot reason with it, tempt it, or intimidate it. And unlike a true animal, which might be motivated by territory or fear or basic survival, the Tarrasque's survival is never in question. Nothing can really threaten it. It is, as one writer put it, a perfect engine of destruction. The question of motivation for the Tarrasque thus largely reduces to hunger or a built-in impulse to eradicate. The 2nd edition Monstrous Manual states that when the Tarrasque is active, awake, it will eat everything within its reach, not just animals and people, but all living material, including plants. It is an eating machine, essentially a walking extinction event for any ecosystem it enters. Fortunately, this same lore notes that the Tarrasque's cycles of activity are short compared to its dormancy. It might wake for only a few days or weeks, then return to a deep sleep for months or years or longer. This fits the narrative of a creature that periodically ravages the world but is not constantly roaming. Otherwise, nothing would survive anywhere. The unpredictability of its awakening adds to the fear. No one can say when or where the Tarrasque will stir next, so communities in the know live with a distant anxiety that perhaps one year the harvest will be disrupted not by drought or war, but by the footfalls of the Tarrasque. One delightful bit of 2nd edition lore, courtesy of an article in Dragon magazine, expanded on the ecology of the Tarrasque with imaginative detail. Ed Greenwood's Ecology of the Tarrasque, published in Dragon number 359 in 2007, which technically was 3rd edition era, but harkened back to earlier lore, described the monster's biology in almost scholarly terms. For example, it detailed that the Tarrasque has 3 stomachs in sequence. The first stomach grinds and crushes whatever is swallowed with muscular action, and even vestigial claws or spines inside, essentially tenderizing and breaking it down. The second stomach is a lake of potent acid that dissolves and even strips magical properties from anything consumed. So much for enchanted swords or armor that a hapless hero might have had on them. The Tarrasque's gut ensures no indigestible surprises. The third stomach then incinerates the remains in a furnace-like final process, absorbing every last bit of energy. The Tarrasque produces no waste. It converts everything it eats into fuel for itself, or perhaps into more of its nearly indestructible body. This level of detail, while gruesome, further emphasizes the Tarrasque's role as a world cleanser. It leaves nothing behind. It also explains why the creature doesn't leave obvious scat or tracks of destruction beyond footprints. It utterly consumes its prey. The article also noted a fascinating adaptation. When the Tarrasque is ready to hibernate again, it can burrow into the earth, not by clawing a tunnel, but by an innate magic that lets it swim through earth and stone as if they were water. Like the elemental creature Zorn, the Tarrasque can simply sink into the ground and bury itself, leaving no tunnel or cavity. The earth closes behind it. This makes tracking it to a lair extraordinarily difficult. One season it might rampage across a plain, and when it grows sated or the time comes to sleep, it might just step into a mountainside and vanish within it, coming to rest deep in the planet's crust until the next cycle. Many stories of the Tarrasque end with such a disappearance. The survivors left to rebuild and wonder if the beast is truly gone, or if it's lurking just beneath their feet, dreaming. The combination of official second edition material, Dragon Magazine lore, and campaign-setting anecdotes in this era enriched the Tarrasque's story without ever fully demystifying it. Was it a product of evil elementals? A failsafe of the gods? A natural, if extreme, part of the world's life cycle? Different sages and cultures within the game offered different answers, and none could be proven. After all, studying the Tarrasque closely is not exactly easy or safe. This multiplicity of possible origins actually serves the story well. It means any DM can choose the interpretation that best fits their campaign's tone. If you want a classic fantasy vibe of divine punishment, you have it. If you prefer a more sword and sorcery feel of ancient sorcerers and cabals, one could say perhaps an ancient and evil cabal of wizards created it. Indeed, one of the second edition theories mentions that possibility too, only to dismiss it as unlikely musing. If you lean into high fantasy, maybe it's literally a spawn of the planet itself, the world's fury made flesh. During the late second edition period, one peculiar source to mention is Spelljammer, the setting of magical spacefaring between worlds. A 1991 Spelljammer accessory called Practical Planetology introduced a curious tidbit. It described a distant planet named Falx where creatures identical or very similar to the Tarrasque are not unique at all, but exist as a population. On Falx, so the text claims, there are several hundred of these monstrous beings roaming, making that world unimaginably deadly. Some sages in the Spelljammer lore theorized that the Tarrasque of worlds like Toril, Forgotten Realms, or Earth might have been transported from Falx long ago by some foolish entity, rather than being native. Or perhaps the creatures on Falx are a case of convergent evolution, nature producing the ultimate predator in more than one place. This notion was more of an Easter egg for deep lore fans than a widely referenced fact, and many DMs likely ignored it to preserve the Tarrasque's uniqueness on their world. Still, it's an intriguing cosmic footnote. Somewhere out there, an entire ecosystem or graveyard of Tarrasques exists. Imagine an adventurer from Toril who believes the terror of the Tarrasque is singular learning, to their horror, that there are places where such nightmares are almost commonplace. Spelljammer's quirky lore aside, in most grounded campaign narratives the one-per-world rule still applies, keeping things manageable and preventing the absurd scenario of multiple Tarrasques teaming up. A thought so over the top it usually only surfaces in humorous context. Throughout the 90s, as D&D adventures and novels proliferated, the Tarrasque popped up here and there as a reference to ultimate destruction. It was rarely the star of a story. Its role as a campaign-ending force meant it was often reserved for the grand finale, and not every storyline escalated that far. But the creature was sufficiently famous that even where it did not appear, characters might invoke it metaphorically. A wizard might swear by the Tarrasque's teeth in frustration, or a frightened peasant might describe a rampaging giant as being like a Tarrasque, to convey how unstoppable it seemed. The name entered the lexicon as the epitome of a monster, in the same way modern language might use Goliath or Leviathan to mean anything huge. In world, the term Tarrasque connotes the ultimate juggernaut. By the end of AD&D 2nd edition, the Tarrasque was firmly established as part of D&D's core mythos. It had transcended its initial listing in a bestiary to become a story unto itself, a boogeyman for the ages, an embodiment of the theme that no matter how advanced civilization becomes, there are forces of destruction that can rise and reset the clock. With 3rd edition on the horizon in the year 2000, the Tarrasque would soon be introduced to a new generation of players, its reputation preceding it into the D20 era. The launch of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition in 2000 and its 3.5 revision in 2003 brought a comprehensive update to the game's rules and monster designs. The Tarrasque, as one of D&D's marquee monsters, duly received its spot in the new Monster Manual, and was later updated in the 3.5 Monster Manual as well. In terms of lore and concept, the 3rd edition designers wisely chose not to mess with a classic. They kept the essence of the Tarrasque intact. It remained the pinnacle creature of the Monster Manual, the highest challenge rating creature in the core book, challenge rating 20 in 3rd edition. However, the new edition's mechanics and approach to world building put a slightly different shine on the legend, and a few new details emerged around the edges. Firstly, physically and statistically, the 3rd edition Tarrasque was still a colossus of destruction. Its size was classified as colossal, the largest category in 3rd edition, and its strength, natural armor, and damage output were all top-notch. The 3rd edition rules allowed for more precision in some areas. For example, the Tarrasque's carapace in 3rd edition specifically gave it a chance to reflect any line or ray spell back at the caster. There was a percentile chance for reflection, turning magical attacks into a gamble. It also had explicit damage reduction and regeneration values. In 3.5, the Tarrasque has regeneration that can only be overcome by damage of a certain type, epic weapons, essentially. This meant that unless you had epic-level weaponry, something beyond the norm of +5 magic swords, the Tarrasque would just keep regenerating any damage you did. The only a wish can kill it clause was effectively maintained in spirit. 3rd edition's entry notes that if the Tarrasque fails its regeneration after being brought to negative hit points, it remains comatose, but not dead. Only by using a wish or a miracle spell could one permanently slay it. Thus, the legendary invincibility carried on, now couched in the new rule set's terms, but very much the same idea players remembered. A fun addition was quantifying aspects like Swallow Whole, a common monster ability in 3rd edition for large beasts. The Tarrasque could indeed swallow whole creatures of a certain size, up to medium size without trouble. And the Monster Manual helpfully noted just how many creatures it could hold in its multiple stomachs. Up to 32 medium creatures at once could be churning away in its gullet. While one hopes no adventuring party ever found all 32 slots occupied, imagine peering into the abyss of its maw and seeing dozens of previous victims still languishing in the acid. This number underscored how immense the creature's internal capacity was. The 3rd edition era also brought with it a thriving community of homebrew and what-if scenario builders, and even Wizards of the Coast's own website and magazine content occasionally indulged in variants of famous monsters. The Tarrasque became a subject of both serious and tongue-in-cheek experimentation. For instance, an online article once presented variant Tarrasques for DMs who wanted to surprise even those players who thought they knew how to handle the standard beast. These included things like a 5-headed pyro Tarrasque, inspired perhaps by Tiamat, the 5-headed dragon goddess, or simply by the idea of giving it multiple attacking heads like a hydra combined with fiery breath. The premise being maybe a Tarrasque that devoured a wizard's magical laboratory and mutated, growing extra heads that spew flame. Another variant was a spell-warped woodling Tarrasque, an outlandish concept of a Tarrasque that had merged with plant matter and arcane energy, perhaps taking root in a forest and resembling a gargantuan living tree when dormant, only to uproot and rampage as a twisted half-plant juggernaut. These ideas might not be canonical in the core lore, but they demonstrate the creature's iconic status. Authors felt free to spin off imaginative versions of it. Even a modern D20 take appeared, with a nod to Godzilla, essentially statting out the Tarrasque for a modern setting as a kaiju that could threaten a city in a contemporary RPG scenario. Within actual 3rd edition campaign products, direct appearances of the Tarrasque remained rare, reflecting its special status. However, one famed mega-adventure, the world's largest dungeon, published by AEG in 2004 under the D20 license, managed to include just about every monster in the game, Tarrasque included. In that gargantuan dungeon crawl, a single dungeon that could take characters from level 1 to 20 through its many regions, the Tarrasque is encountered deep in a mine section, apparently burrowing towards a pit that imprisons thousands of demons. The implication: if the heroes don't stop it, the Tarrasque will inadvertently unleash an even worse catastrophe by breaking open that demonic well. Or perhaps the demons will escape, and the two forces of destruction will collide. It's the kind of over-the-top epic scenario that the Tarrasque thrives in, and it gave 3rd edition players an official chance to square off with the beast as a set-piece battle rather than a random encounter. By placing it in a contained dungeon environment, the authors ensured a confrontation rather than allowing clever avoidance, a daring gamble for any adventuring group. Meanwhile, the lore-rich Forgotten Realms in 3rd edition continued to acknowledge the Tarrasque's presence. The Forgotten Realms campaign setting book and later supplements would casually reference that the Tarrasque is known to dwell in somewhere far off or deep below. It wasn't central to any storyline in the early 2000s novels, but the grand history of the realms compiled and reiterated many of the historical tales we've already recounted, like the Katashaka Sleeper and Karsus's exploit. They even added a more recent event, in the Year of the Prince, 1357 DR in the timeline just a few decades before the default 3rd edition realms present. A powerful mage attempted a dark ritual that summoned the Tarrasque onto the surface near the Dragon Coast. This ritual required the heads of 7 adult dragons as components, a suitably grisly and epic cost, and indeed brought forth the apocalyptic creature. The aftermath was chronicled in the Forgotten Realms comic book series. A band of heroes aboard the skyship Realms Master from the DC TSR comics of the early 90s, confronted and, astonishingly, managed to defeat or banish the Tarrasque before it could annihilate the region. This battle was depicted over a couple of comic issues, Dragon Smoker and Dragons and Other Beasts, offering a rare visual take on the creature in official media. The hero's success in that story is partly attributed to plot devices, one being that the summoner possibly lost control, or the Tarrasque was drawn back to wherever it came from once the summoning magic waned. Still, it serves as a modern exemplar that the Tarrasque's threat is not just theoretical. There are those reckless enough to try to unleash it, and if they do, it requires the very bravest or luckiest champions to put it down. The notion of cultists or summoners trying to invoke the Tarrasque is an interesting twist that gained traction in the lore. While earlier editions often described the Tarrasque awakening on its own schedule, 3rd edition's era began to flirt with the idea that mortal folly could trigger its arrival. This aligns with many classic monster tropes. Who woke the dragon, so to speak? In this case, perhaps a doomsday cult or insane wizard purposely calls the world ender. The reasons could vary. A nihilistic cult might see the Tarrasque as the hand of their dark god, meant to purge the world. These could be analogous to real-world cults awaiting apocalypse. Or a power-hungry mage could think they have found a way to control the beast for a short time, to wreak havoc on their enemies. A supremely risky gambit, as the summoner is likely to be the first snack once control slips. The Realm's example shows the latter, a mage's overreach. This theme continued into later editions too, with adventure writers seeding rumors of strange sects whose endgame is to bring about the Tarrasque's coming as a fulfillment of prophecy. It's also in the 3rd edition era that we see more systematic discussion of the Tarrasque's place in the multiverse. By now it was well established in multiple sources that the Tarrasque is bound to the material plane. Unlike many monsters, it does not naturally travel to other planes. In fact, some lore indicates it cannot leave the material plane at all, possibly by cosmic design. That means you won't find a Tarrasque rampaging in the abyss or wandering the ethereal plane. This has implications. Some scholars speculated, in-game, that the Tarrasque is the material plane's own defender or balancer, unable to exist elsewhere. Others say that it's a safeguard to keep it out of the hair of gods and extraplanar beings, a creature that even demon lords would hesitate to confront, conveniently leashed to the mortal realm where most of those demon lords won't venture unless summoned. More practically for adventurers, it means that spells that banish or exile creatures to other planes, like banishment or gate, typically fail on the Tarrasque or are short-lived. One can't simply wish it away to another dimension permanently, unless possibly using epic magic far beyond normal means. The material plane is both its domain and its prison. This facet continued to underscore that if a world wants to rid itself of a Tarrasque, killing it with a wish's help or putting it to sleep are the only options. One cannot just send it elsewhere. The concept of alignment and the Tarrasque's mind, or lack thereof, remained consistent in 3rd edition. It was effectively mindless. Intelligence score 3, akin to an animal's cunning at best, and neutral. Thus, spells that manipulate minds or target certain alignments were not going to be useful. You couldn't charm or frighten it with magic. You couldn't detect evil on it, and even if you did, you might get a null result because it's not evil per se. It's simply an unaligned force. This clarity helped players strategize or realize the futility of certain strategies. 3rd edition also had a robust epic level option in the epic level handbook and other supplements, acknowledging play beyond level 20. The Tarrasque, being CR 20 in core, was almost a rite of passage for parties entering epic levels. Many epic level discussions revolve around when and how did your group tackle the Tarrasque. Some daring or unwise mid-level groups even tried to prematurely challenge it using clever tricks, leading to countless forum debates about the bag of holding full of explosives, or using polymorph any object to turn it into a harmless form, or other such theories. The Tarrasque thus also became a popular subject in the burgeoning online D&D community, with threads and articles titled How to Kill the Tarrasque, examining every rule, loophole, or tactic. Of course, dungeon masters could always adjust things. The Tarrasque as written could be a baseline, and a DM could amplify it if players got too metagamey in their approach. It remained an arms race of wits, which in a way kept the creature's mystique alive. If it were straightforward to defeat, it wouldn't occupy that vaunted spot in D&D's gallery of terrors. In summary, the 3rd edition period solidified the Tarrasque's role for a new generation. It was the same apex predator of the material plane, now expressed through the sleek D20 mechanics, but with its legend only growing. The community around D&D treated it almost with affection, a fearsome affection, as the game's resident near indestructible terror. It's telling that as 3.5 wrapped up and the game moved towards 4th edition, the Tarrasque was as much a household name among gamers as ever, often spoken of with a mix of dread and a twinkle in the eye. One day we'll fight the Tarrasque. Many a player would dream or have nightmares about. Little did they know how different the creature's next incarnation would be when D&D took a major turn in design philosophy with 4th edition. In 2008, Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition arrived, bringing a radical redesign to the game's rules and a bold new take on its cosmology. Many classic monsters were reimagined or adjusted to fit 4th edition's streamlined combat system and world building. The Tarrasque was no exception. While it continued to be the ultimate monster in many respects, its 4th edition portrayal introduced some significant changes, both mechanical and lore-wise, that reflected the edition's distinct style. In the 4th edition's Monster Manual, the Tarrasque is introduced early in the book, a sign of its prominence. This time, instead of being a challenge for an entire party of the highest-level characters, it's explicitly presented as a solo encounter monster of level 30, which was the cap of the normal level range in 4th edition. Solo in 4th edition terms means it's designed to fight a whole party by itself and still provide a worthy challenge. Thus, the designers looked at every trick players had used or could use against the Tarrasque and tried to give the creature tools to counter them, ensuring that a confrontation with it would be an epic, dynamic battle rather than an easily exploitable one. One of the biggest new features was addressing the age-old issue: what if the players just fly or stay at range? In prior editions, clever adventurers often exploited the fact that the Tarrasque lacked significant ranged attacks or flight. For example, flying wizards pelting it from above, outside the reach of its 50-foot jumps, was a theoretical way to slay it risk-free, assuming infinite patience and ammo. 4th edition's Tarrasque was given an answer to this. It had a special aura called Extreme Terror that extended 40 feet up into the air, which forcibly pulled flying creatures down toward the ground and limited how high they could get, capping flight altitude at 20 feet within the aura. Essentially, any creature trying to hover above it would feel a supernatural gravity drag. A neat narrative way of saying the Tarrasque's presence denies you the safety of the skies. Additionally, the aura inflicted psychic fear, ensuring even airborne foes were rattled. This meant that fighting the Tarrasque in 4th edition was an up-close affair whether you liked it or not, truer to the idea of facing a titan head-on. 4th edition also gave the Tarrasque some area of effect powers and reactive attacks to make it more boss-like. For example, it had a trample ability that let it move through enemy spaces and deal damage to all it ran over, perfect for simulating it crashing through ranks of soldiers or a cluster of heroes. It also had a swipe that could hit multiple targets with its horns or tail in one swing. Another dramatic move was a roaring frenzy that it could trigger when wounded, when bloodied in 4th edition terms at half health, enabling it to thrash and bite multiple foes in a single turn. These were significant because older editions, while giving it many attacks, still mostly allowed it to direct those attacks at one target at a time, or a handful of adjacent ones. In 4th edition, the Tarrasque truly felt like it could lash out in all directions, making the whole party feel the pain simultaneously, a necessity in a game that emphasized teamwork and often had numerous combatants on the field. Hit points in 4th edition were on a different scale, and the Tarrasques reflected that. It boasted a staggering 1,420 hit points. This number, while not directly comparable to previous editions' HP due to different damage expectations, still conveyed that carving this beast down was an endurance test. Early 4th edition monsters had a reputation for high HP and somewhat low damage output, which could lead to grindy fights. The initial Tarrasque stat block unfortunately fell into that trap to a degree. Some groups found that while the Tarrasque took a long time to slay, chewing through those 1,420 horsepower, its damage per round was not as scary as its legend implied, leading to a somewhat monotonous slugfest if run straight from the book. Recognizing this, later 4th edition publications and the online Monster Vault updates tweaked many monsters for better balance. In Dragon Magazine number 418, December 2012, a special issue that revisited the Tarrasque, Wizards provided an updated stat block for the Tarrasque that upped its destructive potential. They increased its damage, gave it the ability to make extra attacks whenever it was struck, a sort of reflexive tail lash or bite once per round when injured, and removed some vulnerabilities, making it immune to being stunned, for example, so players couldn't lock it down as easily. The intention was clear: to make the Tarrasque fight feel as climactic as its story. They wanted it to actively threaten to wipe out even an optimized party, if the players didn't pull out all the stops. Lore-wise, 4th edition's default setting, sometimes called the Nentir Vale, or just the 4th edition world Axis cosmology, provided a new origin story that aligned perfectly with one of the theories from earlier lore. The Tarrasque was tied to the Dawn War, the primordial conflict between gods and titans primordials at the dawn of time. In the 4th edition mythos, before recorded history, the gods fought the primordials, elemental titans, for control of the newly formed world. It said that as a final act of spite, the defeated primordials fashioned a horrific living weapon to unleash upon the gods' creation. This weapon was the Tarrasque. The elemental princes, archomentals like Imex, Ogremok, etc., each contributed a portion of their essence to the creature. Fire imbued it with an inner furnace and burning wrath. Earth gave it unyielding endurance and the power to burrow and resist harm. Air and water lent aspects to its relentless fury, and perhaps a hint of elemental adaptability. According to these tales, some of the elemental princes perished in the act of creating such a potent abomination, expending their very being to bring it forth. The result was a thing of unquenchable hunger and destruction left behind on the material plane, presumably to carry on the primordial's will of breaking apart the gods' orderly creation. This origin, presented in 4th edition lore and articles, effectively canonized what had been speculation. It wasn't just maybe the elemental lords did it. The 4th edition storytellers boldly said, yes, they did. It fits 4th edition's theme of tying big monsters to cosmic events. For instance, 4th edition lore often explained that many legendary creatures were formed during the Dawn War, or by primal energies. It also gave the Tarrasque a clear place in the big picture. Not just a random monster, but a product of the very war that shaped the world, a leftover doomsday device. Interestingly, by making it a creation of chaos, primordials, to spite the gods, 4th edition's lore frames the Tarrasque as inherently opposed to divine order. In worlds following this lore, the gods likely hate and fear the Tarrasque, but perhaps they cannot destroy it outright. They could only seal it away or leave it dormant. It might even hint that multiple Tarrasques could have been made and unleashed on different worlds, one per world, as often assumed, but each world's Tarrasque being the result of that world's primordials. A 4th edition related article also expanded on the cults and legends around the Tarrasque. It described a sect known as the Reckoners, a doomsday cult who view the Tarrasque not as a force of evil, but as a cosmic judge, a primal spirit of justice and punishment. To them, when the Tarrasque rises, it is delivering necessary judgment on a world grown wicked or stagnant. These cultists actively seek to hasten that day. This aligns with the earlier punishment of the gods angle, except the cult sees the Tarrasque itself as the agent, maybe even worthy of veneration. They might conduct brutal rites or sow chaos to invite the Tarrasque's coming, believing they will be spared or rewarded by being loyal to it. From a campaign perspective, such cultists can serve as harbingers, villains who soften up civilization, or simply serve as the narrative mechanism before the actual beast appears. They could also be deceived. One imagines very few cultists survive the actual arrival of what they prayed for. In contrast, there could also be organizations or prophecies dedicated to stopping the Tarrasque. Perhaps an order of paladins or an ancient circle of druids has sworn to contain it, armed with lore passed down from the last time it awoke. 4th edition's focus on artifacts and relics might come into play. Maybe a legendary artifact, the Talisman of Arges or the Fang of Bator were mentioned as items destroyed by the Tarrasque, has a sister artifact destined to be used against it. These kind of plot hooks often accompanied such a major creature's entry. The 4th edition Monstrous Manual text also gave evocative descriptions of what a Tarrasque attack means. It emphasized how entire armies and towns would mobilize if one was on the move, often futilely. In a nod to the narrative of earlier editions, it mentions the Tarrasque destroying entire kingdoms and then vanishing. It likely also reiterates that only one exists, resting for long spans. Some 4th edition adventures, or at least Dungeon Magazine articles, tease the idea of a campaign finale being the heroes racing against time to find a way to banish or lull the Tarrasque back to sleep before it reaches a densely populated region. Mechanically, as mentioned, the initial 4th edition Tarrasque underwhelmed some DMs, but with the later adjustments, it regained teeth. Descriptions of updated abilities in Dragon number 418 for 4th edition include things like the Tarrasque being able to respond to being attacked by moving or attacking, making it far more dangerous to engage. The designers effectively said, if players try to kite it, hit and run, the Tarrasque will charge or throw debris or otherwise not stay idle. If players cluster, it will trample all of them. If they try trickery, it might have outright immunities. In 4th edition, for instance, it was immune to most status conditions that would hamper it, like stun, daze, etc., once updated. It even had a seismic stomp that could shake the ground and knock everyone prone, representing how the very earth protests its passing. One delightful aside, in 4th edition's cosmology there were categories called abominations, creatures that were unique, extraordinarily powerful, and did not fit any normal ecological niche, often born of godly or primordial acts. The Tarrasque was listed among these alongside beings like the Atropol, an undead godling, or the Phoenix. This classification reinforced that the Tarrasque isn't just a big beast, it's an abomination, a word that in D&D usually implies a sin against the natural order or a remnant of a previous age of creation. Ultimately, 4th edition's contributions to the Tarrasque's mythology were significant, tying it concretely to the Dawn War and elemental creators, and providing practical ways it would be used in the context of that edition's game style. Many of these lore points were so fitting that they continued to influence thinking about the Tarrasque in the next edition, even if not all were explicitly carried forward. By the time 4th edition was drawing to a close, the Tarrasque had been fought on tabletops both in its classic form and in its new, more cinematic form. Some players experienced the dread of watching it blow up buildings. Some 4th edition descriptions mention it hurling chunks of terrain or demolishing structures with ease. And shut down teleportation, the updated 4th edition version prevented easy escape like teleport spells within a radius, so you had to face it or run physically. The idea was that a Tarrasque battle should feel like the climax of a movie, desperate, city-shattering, and time-sensitive, rather than an optimization exercise. This cinematic approach to the Tarrasque carried forward into the design ethos of 5th edition as the game sought to combine the best of both worlds, the rich lore of classic D&D with a straightforward yet epic presentation. When Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition launched in 2014, it aimed to capture the spirit of earlier editions while using a simplified, flexible rule set. In the Monster Manual for 5th edition, the Tarrasque once again took its place as one of the most fearsome creatures in the book, now given the exalted challenge rating of 30, the highest in that edition's core rules. The 5th edition designers leaned more on nostalgia and established lore for the Tarrasque's depiction, presenting it in a way that felt immediately familiar to longtime fans. At the same time, they made a few tweaks and omissions that are worth noting, giving the creature a slightly different feel in play. The descriptive text of the 5th edition Tarrasque calls it the most terrible creature known to inhabit the material plane. This phrasing, echoing earlier lore almost verbatim, reaffirms that in the 5th edition cosmology, as on any D&D world, the Tarrasque is the apex terror. The description highlights its immense size, 50 feet tall, 70 feet long, roughly the same dimensions given historically, and its devastating features, the reflective carapace, the horns, the powerful jaws. It explicitly mentions that there is only one known Tarrasque, keeping with the tradition that it's unique. Interestingly, 5th edition doesn't delve into any new origin story in the Monster Manual entry itself. It stays terse and mysterious. It notes that the Tarrasque slumbers in the world's core for long periods, and that no one can predict when it will next awaken. This aligns closely with the classic Forgotten Realms presentation, for instance, which imagined the creature literally burrowed deep in the earth between rampages. One line in the 5th edition text strikes a chord of finality. It says the Tarrasque is terrible in its wrath, and suggests that the best mortal creatures can hope to do is return it to its slumber when it wakes, for true destruction is beyond their grasp. The idea of tricking or luring the Tarrasque to another plane and sealing it there is mentioned as a theoretical possibility in ancient texts, but it's left as a legend a nod perhaps to folks who always wanted to just banish it to another dimension. The implication is clear. Even in 5th edition, where rules are a bit looser, the expectation is that the Tarrasque cannot be permanently destroyed by conventional means. The Monster Manual doesn't explicitly state you need a wish to kill it, as earlier editions did, but it heavily implies the creature's regenerative powers and cosmic ties make it almost immortal. Mechanically, the 5th edition Tarrasque is a simpler creature than the 4th edition version, but still very formidable. It has a thick armor class due to its natural hide, enormous pools of hit points, around 676 HP in 5th edition terms, and immunity or resistance to many forms of harm. It cannot be charmed, frightened, or polymorphed, for example, and is completely immune to fire and poison, among other things. Its signature carapace ability is now expressed as a chance to reflect any magic missile, line, or cone spell. Whenever it's targeted by such an effect, you roll a d6. On a 6, the spell is reflected back at the caster. Otherwise, on a 1 to 5, the Tarrasque simply isn't affected by the spell at all, except by certain high-level spells which the DM might adjudicate differently. This effectively means most low to mid-level spells just can't touch it. High-level casters might try their luck with powerful magics, but there's always that risk it rebounds. This 1 in 6 reflection rule is a succinct way to capture the spirit of earlier, nearly immune to magic interpretations without making it outright immune to everything. Some creative uses of magic might still work on it, especially non-direct spells like terrain manipulation or buffing allies. The 5th edition Tarrasque's offense is brutal. It can attack up to 5 times in a single turn. Bite, 2 claws, horns, and tail, plus use a Frightful Presence ability, much like a dragon's, causing a save or be frightened to all within 120 feet. Each of these attacks deals hefty damage. Its bite not only does piercing damage, but can also swallow a target whole if that target is large or smaller. Those swallowed suffer acid damage each turn inside its gullet, 56 acid damage per round, a terrifying prospect as you feel your character dissolving. The claws and horn attacks can devastate even heavily armored fighters, and the tail is capable of knocking targets away or down with its tremendous force. In addition, the 5th edition Tarrasque has legendary actions, a concept in 5th edition that allows boss monsters to act outside their normal turn to keep up with a full party. The Tarrasque's legendary actions let it do things like an extra move or a tail attack at the end of another creature's turn, ensuring it remains active throughout a round and can't just be outmaneuvered easily. One thing notably absent in 5th edition's default Tarrasque is any form of ranged or area attack beyond its Frightful Presence. It cannot, by the basic stat block, strike at flying enemies or distant ones, except by moving to them or maybe throwing something as an improvised action, which the DM could allow logically, given it can pick up huge objects. This omission led many to note that the old fly-and-shoot tactic technically could work again in 5th edition if the DM doesn't play the Tarrasque intelligently. For example, having it retreat or go destroy something else until the players come down. Some DMs house rule solutions like giving it the ability to rip up a chunk of earth or a boulder and hurl it, or even a shockwave clap. The designers perhaps assumed most groups facing a CR30 creature would have limited options to exploit it by that point, or they left it to DMS to handle creatively. Regardless, the lack of an explicit anti-air measure was a slight step back toward the earlier edition style. It's worth mentioning that this became a common discussion point in the community. How would you handle players trying to cheaply defeat the Tarrasque, with answers ranging from, the Tarrasque finds a way to reach them, to, it leaves and comes back at the worst time, or simply, the beast's presence causes storms or winds that make flying impossible. Imagination fills gaps where needed. The alignment and intelligence remain the same. The Tarrasque in 5th edition is unaligned, with a bestial intellect, intelligence 3. It cannot speak, and it seemingly does not reason. This means, in a role-playing sense, confronting the Tarrasque is not a social encounter. There's no bargaining or intimidation that will work. The heroes must rely on might, magic, and wit to survive it, not negotiation. In terms of thematic use in 5th edition, the core books provide little vignettes rather than full scenarios. But 5th edition's published adventures did include at least one notable reference, the adventure Icewind Dale. Rime of the Frost Maiden alludes to the Tarrasque as a legendary threat in a sage's notes, foreshadowing the kind of world-killing monsters that exist in D&D's wider lore, though the adventure does not feature the Tarrasque directly, since it's focused on a different plot. It serves to remind players in that story that as bad as things are in Icewind Dale, at least a Tarrasque isn't currently on the loose. A bit of dark humor, perhaps. Fan content and third-party material for 5th edition have enthusiastically included the Tarrasque. Numerous blog posts, videos, and discussions in the 5th edition era ask, is the Tarrasque really as tough as its legend? And people propose ways to buff it if necessary. Often the suggestions are to borrow some of those 4th edition innovations. Give it a shockwave, allow it to hit flying foes, maybe even a breath weapon or beam attack akin to Godzilla's atomic breath, though purists might shudder at arming it with something so untraditional. Wizards of the Coast itself, in playtest materials for the upcoming 2024 refresh, 1D&D, which we'll discuss next, evidently took some of that to heart, teasing that the new Tarrasque would indeed have a form of ranged attack, a thunderous roar or shout that acts like a breath weapon, and other enhanced abilities to truly make it more terrifying than ever. From a lore perspective, 5th edition didn't heavily expand the mythology in official sourcebooks. It was content to refer back to existing lore. Many assumed that the 4th edition origin, primordials, and earlier hints, divine punishment, are both out there as myths in any 5th edition world, left for the dungeon master to choose which is true. The Forgotten Realms in 5th edition has undergone events like the Second Sundering, but none that directly involve the Tarrasque. It's presumably still out there in Toral's deep places, possibly in a state of hibernation after whatever last incident. The summoning in 1357 DR might be that last big one. The world-shaking events of the Sundering did not mention it waking up, thankfully for the people of Faerun. One nice mention comes from the promotional side, the magic. The Gathering crossover set, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, included the Tarrasque as a card, introducing the creature to Magic players with mechanics reflecting its D&D traits. It has haste and can't be countered, playing on the idea it's unstoppable, and it fights when it attacks, simulating its tendency to bite creatures. This is a fun cultural footnote showing that even outside the RPG, the Tarrasque is an emblem of D&D's monstrous offerings. 5th edition's narrative focus tends to be on creating memorable moments rather than deep monster ecology in the core books. So the role of the Tarrasque in a 5th edition campaign is ultimately in the hands of storytellers. It can be the foretold ender of the world in a prophecy the players must avert, or a surprise threat that appears in the epilogue of a campaign to challenge the now legendary heroes. It can even serve as a force of nature that the heroes redirect rather than kill. For example, perhaps the party discovers ancient lore on how to lure the Tarrasque with a specific magical frequency or bait, leading it to a desolate region where it can do little harm, and then inducing its slumber again with powerful rituals. This approach casts the heroes not as slayers, but as saviors who protect civilization without truly destroying the beast, an approach some campaigns might prefer if they want to maintain the Tarrasque as a recurring background menace. From a tone standpoint, 5th edition's treatment is very documentary neutral in text. It states facts about the creature in almost a zoological or mythical register, without embellishing too much on how people feel about it, because that's obvious. They fear and dread it. The dramatic flair is left to the Dungeon Master's narration when such an event occurs in-game. One could say that by the time of 5th edition, the Tarrasque had achieved a kind of legendary Pokemon status among the community. Everyone knows it. Not everyone has actually used or fought it, but it's a shared point of reference. It appears in jokes, t-shirts, and anecdotes. Even outside D&D, the term pops up as shorthand for an unbeatable boss. The developers of 5th edition respected that legacy and delivered a version that is straightforward to run and still terrifying. If anything, some very high-level groups found a few too many loopholes with it, but the majority of tales involving a 5th edition Tarrasque still end with, "We barely escaped with our lives," or "We had to get very lucky to bring it down, and even then, who knows if it's truly gone." It's worth noting that, unlike 4th edition, 5th edition does not explicitly categorize the Tarrasque as an elemental or titan or anything specific beyond monstrosity, titan, in terms of creature type. The word titan is more of a tag meaning an exceedingly powerful being, not tying it to any pantheon or primordial necessarily. So 5th edition keeps it more open-ended in terms of cosmic role. It's a monstrosity, meaning it's of the mortal world, but is unnatural in some way. And titan, meaning unique and colossal. This vagueness allows each setting to nuance the origin. For example, in Eberron, a setting where classic D&D gods and primordials don't directly act in the same way, perhaps the Tarrasque is a product of the vast Kyber, the dragon below, or a tool of the ancient fiendish overlords. In Magic's plane of Zendikar, which borrowed the Tarrasque via the AFR set, one could liken it to the Eldrazi Titans or similar world-consuming entities. So it's adaptable to different cosmologies. By the close of the 2010s, there had not been an official published adventure module in 5th edition that fully centered on a Tarrasque battle. That was possibly by design. A creature like that is better suited to a campaign's custom climax rather than a pre-written one, as it depends so much on the party's composition and the specific world's state. However, many DMs created their own finales featuring it, and some actual play shows and streams have depicted intense showdowns with the Tarrasque, much to viewers' excitement. One famously comedic D&D live play by the group of Acquisitions Incorporated, if memory serves, featured a scenario of multiple Tarrasques, but that was in a zany reality-warping context played for laughs. It underscores that by now, everyone in the community has an image of what a Tarrasque encounter means. The stakes could not be higher, and the spectacle is enormous. With 5th edition well established and beloved, the horizon now looms of a new evolution in D&D rules, sometimes dubbed 1D&D, or the 2024 revision. And naturally, such a milestone invites the question, what will become of the Tarrasque in this new iteration? The designers have already teased that they aim to make it more terrifying than any version in history. Given what we've seen, that's a high bar to clear, but also an exciting promise. Let's turn to that future perspective next. As Dungeons & Dragons looks toward its next era an updated rule set expected in 2024/2025, often referred to as 1D&D or the 2024 edition, the Tarrasque remains firmly in the minds of the game's designers and fans. The forthcoming Monster Manual refresh promises to revisit many iconic monsters, using the knowledge gained from a decade of 5th edition play to enhance them. For the Tarrasque, this means an opportunity to combine all the lessons and lore of previous editions into the most formidable incarnation yet. In previews and designer commentary leading up to the new Monster Manual's release, it's been hinted, and in some cases explicitly revealed, that the Tarrasque will receive new abilities and improvements to truly cement its place as the ultimate challenge. Lead Rules designer Jeremy Crawford noted that while in the 2014 Monster Manual, the Tarrasque had the highest challenge rating, its actual on-table threat could be undermined by clever tactics. The design goal now is to ensure the Tarrasque's danger is not just theoretical or based on a number, but viscerally felt in play. One of the headline additions to the 2024 Tarrasque is a form of ranged attack, specifically described as a earth-shaking shout or roar that works like a breath weapon. This devastating roar is said to recharge periodically, on a roll of 5 to 6 each round, akin to how dragon breaths recharge in 5th edition, and can affect a huge cone area, dealing massive thunder damage and inflicting deafening and frightening effects. Essentially, this gives the Tarrasque a way to attack things at a distance or on high walls and towers, by literally yelling them into oblivion. The imagery is incredibly cinematic. The monster rears back, inhaling, and then unleashes a concussive bellow that shatters buildings, knocks flyers out of the sky, and sends people tumbling like leaves in a hurricane. This addresses directly the lack of a ranged attack from the 5th edition version and ensures no enemy is truly safe just by keeping away. Even hiding behind fortifications might not work, as that roar can blow roofs off and crumble castle walls. Another teased feature is the ability to shut down teleportation and similar escape magic in its vicinity. This harkens back to the 4th edition update where they didn't want players simply dimensional dooring away every time things got tough. It sounds like the new Tarrasque will project an aura or effect that prevents easy magical escape and perhaps even hampers long-range communication. The idea is, once it comes for a city, the city can't just have a wizard snap fingers to evacuate the populace through portals. They must face the horror or physically flee beyond its aura. In narrative terms, this intensifies the drama. It isolates the region of the Tarrasque's attack and forces a showdown. There's also talk that the new stat block will streamline how the Tarrasque uses its legendary actions and multi-attacks, perhaps making it even more fluid in combat. For example, 5th edition's legendary actions required tracking points. The new design apparently simplifies that to encourage the DM to use them freely in any combination, guaranteeing the creature can always put out a certain amount of hurt each round, regardless of player tactics. The designers have hinted that no matter what combination of actions the DM chooses, the Tarrasque will stay on its challenge rating, meaning it won't become unexpectedly weak or strong. It will consistently pose the extreme threat it should. Crucially, Crawford has teased that the new Tarrasque is more terrifying than any previous version in D&D's history. He specifically referenced the scenario many players use to trivialize it, peppering it from long range with arrows or spells, possibly from the air. In his admonition, if anyone has experienced a group of characters attacking it at range, thinking it can't do anything, just meet the new Tarrasque. The implication being, those days are over. The new Tarrasque blows up buildings at long range, shuts down teleportation, and a whole lot more. That tantalizing phrase, and a whole lot more, invites speculation. Perhaps it might have a leap attack, covering great distance in one bound, or even the ability to create minor earthquakes. Maybe it can dig and erupt under distant foes or cause rocks to rain from the sky by pounding the ground. The designers know the legend well, so they're likely adding abilities that evoke all the apocalyptic imagery associated with kaiju and world enders. From a lore standpoint, we might not get a huge narrative in the Monster Manual entry. 5th edition and its successor often keep monster lore concise in core books, leaving deeper exposition to campaign guides or setting books. But one could surmise that any new flavor text will lean into the inevitability of the Tarrasque's threat, and how entire nations must prepare for centuries against the day it wakes. Possibly, they might incorporate a line or two acknowledging known historical calamities caused by it. For example, the fall of Phalorm was marked by the awakening of the Tarrasque, an event seared into the collective memory of all Faerun. Or they might mention the known theories of its creation, maybe referencing both the primordial story and the Punisher story, leaving it ambiguous which, if either, is true in a generic sense. Given that 2024's rules refresh is being timed with the 50th anniversary of D&D, it's fitting to have the Tarrasque, which entered D&D a little later, but still has been around for over 40 years, come roaring back with a vengeance. It symbolizes the game's willingness to iterate and learn. Fans' contributions in pointing out weaknesses in the 2014 design are directly leading to a stronger incarnation now. In terms of campaign usage moving forward, these enhancements suggest that whenever a DM uses the Tarrasque in the new edition, it will be an even more centerpiece event. The Tarrasque might very well headline an official high-level adventure at some point. For example, with Wizards of the Coast expanding into telling legendary endgame stories, as indicated by more high-level content on the way. One can imagine a future adventure path that culminates in the awakening of the Tarrasque or something akin to that. Even if not, the tools provided mean DMs have easier ways to run a satisfying confrontation. The monster's abilities themselves create dynamic challenges, destroying terrain, enforcing movement, etc., that a DM can build a scenario around. Perhaps the heroes need to defend a certain location for a number of rounds until an evacuation is complete, all while the Tarrasque is tearing it apart. Because teleport won't work and the thing can yell down their sending spells for help, they truly are on their own and must stand their ground. Another aspect likely to get attention is the aftermath and stakes of a Tarrasque attack. While stat blocks don't cover that, any DM guide or adventure including it will probably highlight the humanitarian crisis and environmental ruin left behind. Modern D&D storytelling often encourages thinking about consequences. So a party might defeat, subdue, or drive off the Tarrasque, but then they have to deal with what it left. A shattered city, thousands homeless or injured, perhaps lingering magical fallout. Perhaps the creature's blood itself is toxic or has strange properties. There could be entire side quests in a campaign dealing with harvesting a piece of the Tarrasque, or using one of its scales to forge a shield, legendary rewards commensurate with such a foe. Indeed, earlier lore mentioned using its carapace to make gems or weapons. Maybe the new books will revive those tidbits. One legendary magic item in D&D's history is the horn of the Tarrasque in some settings, supposedly carved from one of its horns and possessing great power. Culturally, outside of game mechanics, the Tarrasque star has only risen, With D&D's popularity booming through shows, streams, and a wider audience, more people than ever have heard of this mythical beast, even if they've never played the game. It got name-dropped in mainstream contexts like the D&D movie Honor Among Thieves, The Road to Neverwinter tie-in materials, though it didn't appear on screen, to the slight disappointment of hardcore fans. But perhaps a sequel could escalate to that. In video games, even newer D&D-themed games might not feature it directly, as true Tarrasque battles are rare, expensive to animate, and would overshadow any other plot, but references crop up. For instance, the digital game Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms included a special event involving a Tarrasque, letting players symbolically challenge it for rewards, a playful way to include it in the experience. The ubiquity of the Tarrasque in D&D memes, like jokes about a flump riding a Tarrasque, or the classic myth of the flump is the only creature the Tarrasque fears, a tongue-in-cheek reversal, since flumps are tiny, harmless creatures, shows that it's deeply ingrained in D&D culture as both a serious threat and a beloved icon. Looking forward, one might speculate further. As D&D's multiverse narrative evolves, could we ever see a story where multiple worlds' heroes must deal with multiple Tarrasques? Perhaps if some planar conjunction caused the barriers to falter, a scenario out of Spelljammer Nightmares, where that planet Falx's brood of Tarrasques gets loose into wild space or portals connect worlds allowing more than one to cross paths. That would be beyond epic, possibly veering into absurd, but it's a thought experiment that occasionally surfaces in fandom. What if the Tarrasque from Greyhawk and the one from the Realms met? Would they fight or ignore each other? In all likelihood, the tradition of only one per world will stand, keeping it unique and special. The new lore might emphasize that singular nature even more, perhaps by capitalizing the name, like the Tarrasque. Almost a title more than a species. Whatever the case, it's clear that the Tarrasque's symbolic meaning endures. It represents D&D's ability to challenge even the most godlike player characters, to remind us that in a world of magic and heroes, there are still forces beyond full control. It is the embodiment of the unknown terror that could always be lurking. It keeps high-level play from becoming too comfortable. No matter how powerful you are, there's always the Tarrasque, and perhaps only the gods themselves stand above that. In a narrative sense, the Tarrasque can also be a storytelling device about hubris and balance. Many of the tales we covered involve either a villain's folly, a wizard summoning it, or a kingdom drawing its wrath through arrogance, or a divine reckoning aspect. In a campaign finale, defeating the Tarrasque, even temporarily, can serve as a metaphor. The heroes not only save the world, they prove that teamwork and courage can overcome even fate's worst curveballs. It's often said in RPG design that you should rarely use save-the-world plots because they are overdone. But if you ever do, use them at the very end when players are deeply invested. The Tarrasque is tailor-made for that purpose. It is the world-ending threat by definition. So as we stand on the cusp of D&D's next evolution, the Tarrasque is poised to stomp into the new era more fearsome than ever. And yet, it's comforting in a way. Through all the additions, this monster has been a constant. Players in the 80s cracked open Monstrous Manual 2 and whispered, "What on earth is that thing?" with equal parts dread and excitement. Come 2025, a new generation will flip to the Tarrasque's page in the Monstrous Manual and likely feel that same shiver. The context may change, the stat block, the lore framing, but the core idea persists. The Tarrasque is Dungeons & Dragons' ultimate monstrous embodiment of destruction, a living catastrophe that tests the limits of heroism. From its mythic origins and early D&D appearances through each edition's refinements, up to the present and beyond, the Tarrasque looms large in the game's collective consciousness. It is at once a creature of pure story and a challenge of pure mechanics, bridging the gap between narrative legend and tactical play in a way few other monsters do. Perhaps the final word should be a dramatic reflection. In the multiverse of D&D, where dragons rule the skies and demons lurk in the abyss, the Tarrasque alone walks the earth unchallenged, unbowed, and utterly fearsome. When it rises, bards cease their music, priests offer desperate prayers, and even kings abandon their crowns to join the simple cause of survival. It is the dread of nations, the crush of cities, the devourer of God's folly. And if you ever hear the distant thunder of its footsteps or the rumbling growl of its hunger, know that you stand at the precipice of doom. For the Tarrasque, the world's end incarnate, is come. Outside the core D&D game itself, the legend of the Tarrasque has echoed in various forms of media, adaptations, and fan culture, cementing its status as a pop culture icon for the biggest, baddest monster. While perhaps not as instantly recognizable to the general public as a dragon or unicorn, within gaming and fantasy circles, the Tarrasque is a well-known reference, often used to signify an unstoppable challenge or a comedic, over-the-top threat. Video games. Surprisingly few video games have featured the Tarrasque directly as an encounter, likely because of the creature's unique status and perhaps the challenge of doing justice to something so powerful in a game format. However, it has seen cameos. In the classic Neverwinter Nights by BioWare, the official campaign did not include a Tarrasque fight, but a third-party premium module called Darkness over Daggerford made reference to it. In that adventure, players uncover a plot involving a long-imprisoned Tarrasque beneath the city of Daggerford, a frightful piece of lore that thankfully doesn't result in the creature actually rampaging, as that would end the game world. Still, just the inclusion of the idea shows how it's used to add gravitas to a story's stakes. In the MMORPG Neverwinter by Cryptic Studios, events and quests occasionally nod to famous D&D monsters, while as of this writing, players haven't directly battled a Tarrasque in Neverwinter. Loading screen lore and campaign text mention it. For instance, a curiosity in Neverwinter's early days was an April Fool's event where a miniaturized Tarrasque was a joke mount, pet, poking fun at how players always ask for the most outrageous things. The devs gave them a pint-sized version as a prank reward. Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms, a popular D&D-themed idle clicker game, hosted limited-time events where the player's band of heroes stood off against the Tarrasque in a kind of raid scenario. In these events, the goal wasn't truly to kill it, since that's beyond the scope of the game's idle damage, but to survive as long as possible or deal as much damage as possible before being overwhelmed. A fitting adaptation. Treating the Tarrasque as an endless mode boss. Tabletop spin-offs and board games, the Tarrasque has appeared in D&D-themed board and card games. The 1990s AD&D trading cards line and the later Spellfire collectible card game naturally included the Tarrasque as a rare, powerful card, often with special rules to reflect its invincibility. For example, the Spellfire card for the Tarrasque might require multiple allies to defeat or a very high-level champion. In more modern times, Dungeon Mayhem, a light D&D card game, introduced an expansion where one card is humorously titled Tarrasque, depicting not the real Tarrasque, but a character in a cardboard cutout costume of one for fun, showcasing that even the name alone brings a smile of recognition. Novels and fiction. though the Tarrasque hasn't been the central focus of many novels, given it's hard to write a narrative from the perspective of a mindless engine of destruction. It has appeared or been referenced in fiction. We mentioned Ed Greenwood's Only a Woman Can Take This Sort of Abuse, a whimsical short story that name-drops the Tarrasque likely as an exaggeration or humorous aside within the tale. The title itself is comedic, part of Ed's Spin a Yarn series. In that story, a host of bizarre events occur at a grand feast, and the Tarrasque is referenced likely to elicit a chuckle, the idea being, what crazier thing could happen than a Tarrasque showing up at a party? It's used for hyperbole. In more serious fantasy novels set in the Forgotten Realms, authors like Greenwood or R.A. Salvatore generally steered clear of deploying the Tarrasque, as their protagonists Elminster, Drizzt, etc., while mighty, typically dealt with threats that allowed for more dialogue and cunning. The Tarrasque is almost too blunt a plot device for novel narrative. Once it appears, it either destroys everything or the heroes miraculously stop it. There's a little in between for character development. That said, some novels set in the ancient past of the realms or in world-shaking times may mention it in passing as part of the world's perilous lore. The Grand History of the Realms book, which is sort of an in-world compilation of historical events, reads like a narrative and includes the Kata Shaka Sleeper Saga and Karsus's harvesting of the Tarrasque pituitary, effectively canonizing those as part of the shared story. So while not novelized in long form, those events form a backdrop to other tales. For instance, a novel dealing with Netheryl's fall might allude to Karsus's preparations and the extreme measures he took, including messing with the Tarrasque. Comics, the DC TSR Forgotten Realms comic, 1989-91, written by Jeff Grubb, probably has the most prominent showcasing of the Tarrasque in a narrative beyond game books. In issues 7 through 8 of that series, the heroes, a band of adventurers traveling the realms on a flying ship, confront the Tarrasque, which has been summoned by a villain. The comic medium allowed the artist to illustrate the enormity of the creature. There are memorable panels of the Tarrasque looming over buildings, the heroes looking tiny in comparison, engaging in a desperate fight around and on top of the monster. One of the heroes uses a powerful artifact and teamwork to bring it down, but even then the beast isn't truly killed. It's a temporary victory. These comics gave many fans who might not have fought the Tarrasque in-game a visual reference for just how monstrous it is. Decades later, those images still circulate online among D&D enthusiasts. Streaming and shows, with the rise of live-stream D&D, Critical Role, Dimension 20, etc., the Tarrasque occasionally makes a dramatic entrance. Critical Role's first campaign famously did not culminate in a Tarrasque battle, but Matt Mercer, the Dungeon Master, has joked about using it, and even released a one-shot where a party of super high-level characters intentionally sought out the Tarrasque to prevent it from awakening later. In other streams or one-offs, DMs sometimes pit all-star groups, multiple big characters from different campaigns, against the Tarrasque as a fun what-if scenario, almost like Fantasy Avengers vs. Godzilla. These events are often celebratory. The audience knows this is the biggest monster, so seeing beloved characters take it on is a treat. One such instance, the finale of the streaming series The Dungeon Run, Campaign 1, had the party confront a Tarrasque that had been twisted by eldritch magic, making it even more deadly. It served as both a literal and metaphorical climax, the heroes overcoming their greatest fear and thereby symbolically overcoming personal struggles as well. The live audience cheered when the beast fell, highlighting how the Tarrasque, as a narrative device, can deliver catharsis when defeated, memes and references, the Tarrasque has also become a bit of an internet meme within geek culture. You'll find fan art that crosses it with other franchises. For example, a parody image of a Pokemon Tarrasque used Hyper Beam, or a Magic. The Gathering mock card named Super Ultra Death Monster, clearly modeled on the Tarrasque's description for humorous effect. It's also common in RPG humor to see the Tarrasque used in absurd situations. My level 1 bard seduces the Tarrasque, or the Tarrasque is secretly a werewolf, full moon beware. These are not serious, but show how the creature is part of the shared language of D and D. Everyone gets the joke because everyone knows the Tarrasque is way beyond the scope of a bard's charm or a typical lycanthrope. Another comedic concept is the idea of something trivial defeating the Tarrasque through a loophole. For example, the famous theoretical scenario called the peasant railgun, a chain of peasants passing a rock with increasing speed, ends with them flinging a rock that kills the Tarrasque in one hit by abusing physics-breaking speed. This was a forum joke illustrating how game rules can be misused. The Tarrasque is often chosen in such thought experiments as the benchmark of, if it can kill the Tarrasque, it must be truly broken. Educational and fan wiki references. The Tarrasque even appears in non-gaming contexts as a reference point. For example, TV Tropes, the website cataloging tropes in media, has an entry for Tarrasque under tabletop gaming, explaining its role as the unstoppable force. It's used as an example on trope pages like Bonus Boss. An optional, nearly impossible boss in video games is sometimes compared to fighting the Tarrasque. In science and tech circles, someone might humorously name an algorithm or a bug in a program a Tarrasque if it's a huge, hard-to-solve problem rampaging through their code. And, of course, the original French Tarrasque has not been forgotten either. In the town of Tarrasque, France, they still celebrate the legend with festivals and a large effigy of the Tarrasque paraded around. D&D's borrowing of the name has, in a weird roundabout way, introduced some gamers to this piece of real folklore. A few might even travel to Provence and see a statue of the Tarrasque, bemused that in that story the beast was pacified by a saint rather than requiring a band of adventurers and a wish spell. Crossovers with Wizards of the Coast owning both D&D and Magic, The Gathering. We've seen cross-pollination. We mentioned the magic card of the Tarrasque, a powerful green creature that can enter play with haste and forces fights, referencing its role as a hunter that will take on anything. It's fun for Magic players who may not know D&D to encounter this card and perhaps be curious about the myth behind it. Conversely, D&D has adapted magic creatures in books like Mythic Odysseys of Theros and Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, but those worlds have their own equivalents of world eaters. The Theros campaign has titans, which are not unlike Tarrasques in scale. Should there ever be a full Magic D&D crossover storyline, one could imagine planeswalkers, Magic's wizard characters, having to deal with a wayward Tarrasque ravaging a plane, a true multiverse crisis event. In sum, the Tarrasque's presence in non-tabletop media is somewhat limited, but highly impactful whenever it appears. It is often used sparingly, which is appropriate. If every video game or novel had a Tarrasque, it would diminish the special terror it brings. Instead, creators deploy it when they want to instantly convey, "This is beyond catastrophic." And fans, even those who have never rolled a D20, might learn to say, "That's my Tarrasque to bear," or some joking phrase meaning an overwhelming burden, simply because they absorbed the concept secondhand. Reflecting on the Tarrasque's journey through lore and media, one cannot escape the thematic weight it carries. In D&D storytelling, the Tarrasque is more than a monster. It's a symbol, a narrative tool, and a thematic statement. Symbol of cataclysm. At its most basic, the Tarrasque symbolizes catastrophic destruction. It is often equated to natural disasters, an earthquake with legs, a living volcano of hunger. Campaign worlds use it as a looming threat the way our world's ancient myths used floods or fires sent by gods. This makes it a powerful device for DMS to signal an end-of-time scenario. If a campaign has gradually escalated stakes, bringing in the Tarrasque is a way to say, this is it, the ultimate peril. Its very name in a narrative can make players sit up straighter, hearts pounding. Thematically, this ties into ideas of apocalypse and renewal. In stories where the Tarrasque appears, there's often an undercurrent of the world will not be the same after. If the heroes fail, civilization could fall, and a dark age commence until the beast sleeps again and survivors rebuild. If the heroes win, their world is still scarred, but given a second chance, often prompting a new era in the campaign setting's history. For example, if a DM decided that in their homebrew world the Tarrasque awakened and was banished in the year 500, the year 500 becomes a marker in their lore, the year of the Great Devastation or such. Kingdoms might count time as before or after that event. Test of heroism. For player characters, facing the Tarrasque is the ultimate test. It's a confrontation, not just of brawn, but of character. Many classic heroic themes come to the fore. Self-sacrifice. Heroes might have to lay their lives on the line, and some may truly die in the attempt, to stop the creature. It's hard to fight a Tarrasque without casualties if you play fair. Thus, players often must make tough choices. Perhaps one character luring it away knowing they can't outrun it, buying time for others. Unity and strategy. Unlike a single villain with a cunning plan, the Tarrasque doesn't scheme. It simply arrives as a force. The only way to beat a force is with force multiplied by cleverness. It encourages players to strategize at a high level, utilize terrain, exploit any possible weakness. Is it attracted to a certain bait? Can we trap it in a gorge? Can we keep it contained until a ritual completes? It often takes every class's unique strengths to even have a shot. Warriors hold the line, wizards try experimental magic, clerics bolster everyone and might seek divine aid, rogues coordinate evacuations or attempt a crazy internal sabotage, perhaps literally getting swallowed on purpose to target a weak point inside. It's an all-hands-on-deck moment, the triumph of good or determination over despair. Fiction is replete with examples where an unstoppable force is halted by unlikely heroes, reinforcing an optimistic message that hope and courage can win against even the darkest hour. If a DM chooses, the Tarrasque encounter can be woven with character arcs. Maybe a hero prophesied to be a coward finds their bravery here, or a character seeking redemption finds it by standing firm against the monster to save innocence. Divine or cosmic significance, the presence of the Tarrasque in a story, often invites theological or philosophical reflection by characters. If they have clerics or paladins in the group, those characters might interpret the event through their faith. Is this our God testing us? Is it punishment? In worlds with active deities, one might expect some divine guidance or intervention when a Tarrasque awakens. Or the alarming silence of the gods could be its own answer. Even the gods are afraid or cannot help right now. One campaign might frame it as a cosmic balancing act. Perhaps, long ago, the gods swore not to slay the Tarrasque, because it's needed for some distant end-of-the-world cycle, so they constrain themselves to empowering mortals to deal with it temporarily. ultimate villain, or unaligned threat. Depending on campaign tone, the Tarrasque can serve as a villain, albeit a mindless one, or just an event. If the campaign has had an overarching villain, say an evil archmage or cult, perhaps that villain's final act is unleashing the Tarrasque. In that case, the story climax has two layers: the defeat of the villain, and then the mitigation of the monster they unleashed. Alternatively, if a campaign has been more about exploration or political intrigue and suddenly the Tarrasque shows up due to a natural cycle, it shifts into a disaster movie genre. The heroes might not feel animosity towards the Tarrasque like they would a villain. You can't hate a hurricane for being a hurricane, but they must still muster all their resources to survive it. In this usage, it's a test of adaptability. Can the campaign pivot from human-scale conflicts to this titanic threat? Campaign reset button. Some dungeon masters have, only half-jokingly, used the Tarrasque as a way to reset a campaign world when things have gotten too escalated, or if they're wrapping up a campaign and want to go out with a bang. Because if the Tarrasque wins, essentially the campaign is over in a literal and figurative sense. If the players are up for it, a DM might essentially say, "Let's have one last crazy session. Tarrasque attack. If you win, you're world-renowned saviors. If you lose, we end on a dramatic, tragic note." Either way, it concludes the story definitively. This is something to be done with care, obviously, and full player buy-in, since it can feel like a deus ex machina or diabolus ex machina otherwise. But in the right setting, like a one-shot or a high-level short arc, this is exactly the role the Tarrasque fills best. The final chapter, after which the book is closed and maybe a new story begins after a time skip. Player psychology and the Tarrasque. On a meta level, players often treat the Tarrasque with a mix of fear and excitement. Knowing its reputation, even the suggestion of it can cause panic, which is a tool a DM can use. Sometimes a DM drops rumors of a huge beast stirring in the south to see players' reactions. Clever DMS might subvert expectations, too. Perhaps all signs point to a Tarrasque awakening, but the threat is something else, or vice versa. A false alarm keeps tension high. However, outright bluffing about a Tarrasque can be dangerous. If players think it's coming and prepare intensely, spending resources, altering plans, and it never shows, they might feel let down. So usually if you introduce Chekhov's Tarrasque, you want to eventually have it appear, even if not in the way expected. Use in various genres, though typically high fantasy, even different styles of campaigns can involve the Tarrasque with a twist. In a planar or planescape campaign, maybe the characters hear of an entity on the material plane that even the fiends speak of in hushed tones, leading to an interesting role reversal, where devils hire the party to ensure the Tarrasque never finds a way off its world. Better the mortal world be ravaged than it come to the hells, a devil might reason. In a mythic heroic campaign, like inspired by Greek myth, the Tarrasque could be reflavored as a legendary beast to be slain by demigods, akin to Hercules facing the Nemean lion, but on a world-ending scale, perhaps a labor for a demigod to prevent a prophecy of doom. Role-playing a Tarrasque encounter. While the Tarrasque itself doesn't speak, a rich role-playing scene can surround it. There might be war councils, evacuation speeches, tearful goodbyes as people flee their homes, tense negotiations for aid from a reluctant king. Lend us your elite Griffin riders. Only they can harry the beast's eyes and slow it down. If any NPC allies have been part of the campaign, this is a dramatic time for them to shine or fall. The DM can create vignettes of the horror, villagers forming bucket brigades to douse fires, or a lone knight standing atop a hill reading their family's ancestral oath of protection as the silhouette of the Tarrasque looms. Such scenes make the event feel real and weighty, beyond just a minis battle on a grid. Aftermath and hope, assuming the players win, which might mean truly killing it, or more likely driving it off, sealing it, etc. The aftermath is an equally important thematic phase. It's the eucatastrophe, a term Tolkien coined for the sudden turn from tragedy to rescue. The sun rises over a shattered, smoldering land, but people emerge from hiding, amazed to be alive. The heroes are not just victors, they're saviors. It's a moment of bittersweet triumph because the costs were high, but the future was saved. Campaigns often epilogue with rebuilding efforts, monuments being erected to the heroes, perhaps the players' characters taking on leadership roles to help the land recover. In some stories, the heroes themselves are forever changed. Maybe one becomes the guardian of the Tarrasque's slumbering site, starting a lineage of wardens to watch in case it ever stirs again. If the players lose, well, it's presumably the end. Perhaps a few manage to escape, living with guilt or resolve, trying to gather strength for a rematch years later if one wanted to run a sequel campaign. But usually a Tarrasque defeat of the party is effectively a TPK total party kill, plus a world state change. DMs rarely go that route unless it's collaboratively intended as a tragic ending or a pivot to a post-apocalyptic version of the setting. Variations and player-created myths. Players themselves have created variations on the Tarrasque in their imaginations, like the notion of a flying Tarrasque. Tongue-in-cheek, what if you gave it wings? It would remove even the slightest hope of escape. Or the idea of a half-dragon Tarrasque, which theoretically one could do with templates in 3rd edition, resulting in something even more absurd, breathing fire in addition to everything else. These are usually seen in forum jokes or what's the most broken thing you can think of discussions. The fact that the Tarrasque is chosen as the base for such hypotheticals shows it's seen as the pinnacle. The only way to go further is to augment it with another pinnacle, like a dragon's powers. In some campaigns, DMs have introduced lesser versions or related creatures for variety. For example, maybe there's a creature called a Tarrasquil, a smaller cousin that is still huge and nasty but not quite world-ending, used at mid-levels to foreshadow the real deal, though doing so can diminish the uniqueness if not careful. Alternatively, mythologies might mention ancient Tarrasque spawn that roamed in prehistoric times, maybe giving an excuse for fossils or remnants, a great red herring as the heroes find a colossal skeleton and think it's the Tarrasque, but it's actually one of its offspring from an epoch long past, meaning the real one is still out there. Generally, though, the consensus is to keep the Tarrasque singular for full effect. Comparative threats. In D&D's vast array of monsters, there are a few that rival or exceed the Tarrasque in specific ways. Demon lords like Demogorgon or archdevils like Asmodeus have world-threatening potential, and great worm dragons can be intelligent, plotting foes behind Kingdom Falls. But those are sentient and often tied to schemes. The Tarrasque stands apart as pure, unreasoning destruction. One might draw a parallel to the difference between Sauron and, say, Ungoliant in Tolkien's Legendarium. Sauron is an intelligent, devil-like villain, whereas Ungoliant, the giant primordial spider, is a being of insatiable hunger that even Sauron's master Morgoth could barely control. The Tarrasque is D&D's Ungoliant in that sense. No one truly controls it. Those who think they do are proved wrong, and even other great evils treat it gingerly. This means thematically, the Tarrasque can sometimes unite enemies. One can imagine a scenario where factions that hate each other, perhaps a kingdom and an orc horde, or a guild of necromancers and a church of paladins, call a temporary truce to deal with the bigger threat of a Tarrasque on the loose. It's the Independence Day scenario, where feuding nations join forces against the alien invader. If your campaign has complex politics, nothing simplifies priorities like a Tarrasque knocking on the city gates. The weight of using the Tarrasque. As a DM, bringing the Tarrasque into your story carries weight. It's like playing a trump card. Thus, many DMS will save it for when it really matters. Once the Tarrasque has appeared in your world and been dealt with, it's hard to escalate beyond that, unless you go into god-killing territory or multiverse collapse, which is a different kind of story. So, thematically, the Tarrasque often marks the climax of high fantasy adventure. It seldom appears twice in one campaign. It's a one-time event, win or lose. This exclusivity contributes to its legendary status. In conclusion, the thematic impact of the Tarrasque in D&D is profound. It brings finality, tests virtue, and amplifies the scale of any adventure to mythic proportions. Whether used as a dire warning in a campaign's lore or as the actual final boss, it forces both characters and players to confront what ultimate threat really means. In a game fundamentally about heroes, the Tarrasque is the ultimate foil, a monster that cannot be reasoned with or tamed, only overcome by true heroism or sheer luck. And that is perhaps why it fascinates us. It strips a D&D scenario down to the primal conflict of survival and destruction, offering a canvas for the greatest acts of bravery and, indeed, storytelling. Conclusion. Across the editions and the ages, the Tarrasque stands tall, 50 feet tall in fact, as a cornerstone of Dungeons & Dragons lore. We've journeyed from its origins in medieval French legend to its introduction in the first edition Monstrous Manual 2, and onward through each generation of the game. We've seen how each edition's lens, whether the raw, minimal descriptions of AD and D, the lore-rich speculations of second edition, the mechanical exactitude of third, the cinematic redesign of fourth, or the balanced classicism of fifth, has added to the tapestry of the Tarrasque's myth. In all these tales, several themes emerge consistently. The Tarrasque is unique, nearly unstoppable, and deeply woven into the fabric of the worlds it inhabits. Mortals fear it, gods possibly created or permitted it, and storytellers use it to signify the extreme. It's a creature that can end a campaign in glorious victory or tragic destruction. It reminds us, as players and game masters, that in a world of magic and miracles, there are still mountains that cannot be moved without great cost, and that makes the act of trying all the more heroic. From a neutral documentary perspective, one might say the Tarrasque's in-universe significance lies in being the ultimate predator and a living catastrophe serving various roles: a scourge, a punishment, a test, a legend, in different cultures' myths within the game. Dramatically, it is the final drum roll in the symphony of a high-level campaign. Thus, whether you encounter the Tarrasque as a line of text in a bestiary, as a figurine on a gaming table towering over your miniatures, or as a plot point in a novel or show, know that it carries the weight of decades of lore and the screams and cheers of countless gaming groups who have faced the challenge and lived to tell the tale. It is, without a doubt, one of D&D's most enduring legends, the Tarrasque, the monster that is itself the stuff of legend. Thank you for joining this journey through the fascinating realms of Dungeons & Dragons lore. If you enjoyed exploring these tales and the endless possibilities they bring to your tabletop adventures, don't forget to like and subscribe for even more stories from across the multiverse. We'd love to hear your favorite moments from your own games, epic battles, legendary quests, or unforgettable encounters. Share them in the comments below and keep the adventure alive. Until next time, roll high, stay curious, and may your stories always grow more legendary.